Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. As always, I ask for your help in spreading the word about my channel. I've won a couple of awards for Best Instruction from the Chess Journalists of America. So if you could tell your chess friends about Dan Heisman Chess, that would greatly help. I think people would greatly benefit. That's my dog, Harry, saying hi. I thought today we would talk a little bit about improving your thought process. Now, I have an entire playlist with dozens of videos about improving your thought process, but I thought we'd talk about an aspect or two in particular. And I'd like to start with the part of the process that determines how long should your process be, which I call micro time management. But that's not important that I call it micro time management. But the important part is the two main things that would determine how long you're going to think about a move are the clock situation and the criticality assessment of the position. So let's talk a little bit about the clock assessment, and then we'll get more into the criticality assessment. So the clock assessment, obviously, suppose you're playing a game with 90 minutes in a 30-second increment, a nice classical slow game. Then your moves are going to take a lot longer than if you're playing an online speed game, let's say a 10-0 game or something. So obviously, the amount of time that you have for the whole game, the amount of time you have remaining on your clock is very important. Also, if you're playing in a tournament and you have to make like 40 moves in 90 minutes, then how many moves left you have to make the time control is also important. So you have all these factors involved with your time. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of shrinking their time proportionally when the game shrinks proportionally. So for instance, if they would think a certain amount of time on a 90-minute game, if they're playing a 10-minute game, they would think 1/9 as long. That's close to being correct, but the problem with that is you really want to take more time on your critical moves than your non-critical moves. So you want to shrink your non-critical moves even more than your critical moves. So for instance, if you would take 45 seconds on a non-critical move in a 90-minute game, in a 10-minute game, which is 1/9 of that, instead of taking 5 seconds, you might actually only take 2 or 3 seconds to make a move like that. Now, obviously, if you have an increment, you don't need to quite move that fast, but you want to save your time for critical moves, and the shorter the game, the more you need to save your time for critical moves. In longer games, usually if you play at a reasonable pace and you get to a critical position, usually you have some time on your clock that you can spend if you're not playing too slow. Okay, so criticality assessment and time management. So we're looking at figuring out how much time to take on a move. So when you have more time on your clock, obviously, every time you play a move, you want to ask yourself, while your opponent's thinking, you want to ask, am I playing too fast or am I playing too slow? And you want to adjust accordingly. You should, before the game starts, you want to figure out the average time you have for a move. So for instance, suppose you're playing a sudden death game where you have 30 minutes for the game, and let's say there's a no increment. That's easy to calculate when there's no increment. So if it's a 30-minute game, then assume at the start of the game that the game's going to last 40 moves. It may last a lot longer than that. It may go a lot shorter. You don't know. But 40 is a good number to start with if the game hasn't even started yet. So 40 into 30 goes 3/4. 3/4 of a minute is 45 seconds. So you should know before the game even starts, if you're playing a 30-0 game, that you're going to have about 45 seconds on the average for each move. But that also tells you that when you're playing non-critical moves, that you want to take a lot less than 45 seconds, so that when you have critical moves, you can take a lot more than 45 seconds without getting into unnecessary time pressure. We have Botvinnik's rule, which is when you're playing a slow game and you're playing a normal opening, you want to use no more than about 20% of your time for your first 15 moves. So if you're playing a 30-0 game and you use Botvinnik's rule, 30-0, 20% of that is 6 minutes. That would say you want 24 minutes left after move 15. But actually, as I learned from National Master Ken Potts, you want to have even more than 24 minutes left if you're playing such a short time control game. And I know a lot of you think that 30 minutes is a long time control game, but actually Botvinnik's rule is a little bit too liberal for a 30-0 game. Oh, there's my doggies playing again. But Vinnick's rule is too liberal. So what you really want to do if you're playing a 30-0 game is you want to have about 26 or 27 minutes left when you get to move 15. All right, let's talk a little bit about criticality assessment now. How do you know a position is critical? Position is critical if there's a good chance that that move could help decide the game. In other words, suppose you turn on the evaluation button and show the top 3 moves, and the top move is plus 2.6, and the second move is plus 0.3, and the third move is minus 0.3. Then it's critical that if you want to win the game, you need to find that best move. Or let's say the first move is plus 0.7 and the second move is minus 2.3. Then it's critical that you want to find the best move to retain somewhat of an advantage. But if you don't, then you could be losing the game if you don't find that move. So whenever the top move or two is much better than the moves below it, that could be critical. But you don't have an engine running during the game. You have to do that yourself. So what are some of the aspects of a position that could tell you it's critical? Well, first of all, you have checks, captures, and threats. If there are meaningful or potentially dangerous checks, captures, or threats on the board, that tells you that it's very likely critical. Or if you have sacrificed material for a mating attack, obviously it's critical because you're down material and you need to be able to execute the mating attack. What else could tell you it's critical? How about if you see seeds of tactical destruction in your opponent's position and you think, maybe I have a tactic. Well, that could be a critical position as well. So you have a lot of these things that tell you that it's critical. Here's another one. Suppose someone takes something and you have 4 or 5 ways of recapturing. Maybe even only 2 ways of recapturing. Usually when you have multiple recapturing possibilities, it's at least minorly critical and you want to take some time. I see a lot of my students, when they see multiple captures, they just use hand waving and they take one real fast. And a lot of times that's a mistake. You want to make sure that when you're recapturing, you're capturing with the piece that makes the most sense. That's very important, especially if you're capturing with pawns. You know, we have principles like capture toward the center and things like that, which will tell you if there's 2 pawns that can capture, capturing the one toward the center is generally correct. Not always, it's not a rule, it's a principle. I thought I'd illustrate some criticality with this position that occurred in one of my students' games. So let's take a look at it. It's white's move. If we just use the safety table, and for those of you that didn't see the video, the safety table just says on each square that's attacked by an opposing piece what the capturing sequence safety would be. So in this position, there's not a lot of safety table information. The a6 pawn is attacked by the bishop on f1, but it's guarded by the rook on a8, it's guarded by the pawn on b7, and indirectly it's guarded by the bishop on c8. In other words, if there was a bunch of captures on a6, the bishop on c8 could participate once the pawn on b7 does. So obviously the safety table would tell you that the pawn on a6 is extremely safe. What else is being attacked by an enemy piece? Well, the white knight on d4 is attacked by the bishop on c5, so the knight on d4 is attacked once, it's guarded once, and the value of the pieces are basically the same, so that tells you the knight on d4 is ostensibly safe. The pawn on e6 is attacked by the knight on d4, but the pawn on e6 is guarded by the pawn on f7 and then the bishop on c8. So the safety table would say that pawn on e6 is very safe. So does that mean just because the safety table says that everything on the board is safe, does that mean everything's safe? Well, no, because there's dynamic possibilities that you have to take into account on figuring out whether or not something might be a discovered attack or a skewer or maybe a mating attack. In this case, we have an LPDO, a loose piece drops off. That's called Nunn's dictum. Nunn's dictum is the most common seed of tactical destruction. A seed of tactical destruction is something wrong with the opponent's position that tells you there might be a tactic. So the question is, can we move that knight with tempo on d4 so that if he does something with that tempo, we can capture the bishop on c5 with the discovery? Well, most of the knight moves don't do much. If we play knight to c2, for instance, then we're guarding the bishop on e3, but black can save the bishop just by trading the bishops. So we do have some knight moves that are interesting. We could put the knight on 4 to b5 and threaten to fork on c7, But even better is we could capture a pawn on e6, which also threatens the fork. So let's start to calculate that. Knight on d4 takes the pawn on e6. I'm not going to move it on the board. For those of you that are lower rated and want to see me make the moves, try to practice visualization of the moves, because if you don't practice it, it doesn't get better. And visualization is a very important part of playing. So unless you're playing, correspondence games or daily games on chess.com where you're allowed to set up the board and move the pieces, when you're analyzing something, you have to move the pieces in your head. And if we show you that on the video and you don't practice doing it yourself, then you don't get better at it. Practice may not make you perfect, but practice will make you better. All right, so let's imagine, let's use our visualization to say that the knight on d4 takes the pawn on e6. We don't have to move all the other pieces on the board. The only thing that's moved is that knight on d4. It's now on e6 in place of that black pawn. Well, clearly, if black recaptures f takes e6 or bishop takes e6, white plays bishop takes c5, and he wins a pawn. Is that the end of it? Well, no, because black has a capture himself to try to get back at white. So let's take a look at that. So we have knight takes e6. The interesting line is where black plays bishop takes e3. If now white plays f takes e3, then black captures on e6 and wins a piece for a pawn. So white can't do that. So after knight takes e6 and black plays bishop takes e3, white has to check with the knight. And he has two possibilities. There's knight g7 check and there's knight c7 check. We can eliminate knight g7 check. Why? After knight takes e6, we're going to start at the beginning each time. After knight takes e6, bishop takes e3, and knight takes g7 check, black can play king f8 attacking that knight. And if white saves the knight, then black saves his bishop on e3. And if white takes the bishop on e3 with f takes e3, then black plays king takes g7. So let's do that again. Try to visualize it. Knight captures the pawn on e6. Bishop captures on e3. Knight takes the pawn on g7 check. The king goes to f8, attacking the knight on g7. If white now plays knight h5 to save the knight, then or even knight f5. Well, let's say knight h5 to save the knight. Then black will just move the bishop on e3 back to some safe square. Let's say back to c5 again, and white has end up losing that bishop on e3. So the interesting line is the check on c7, forking the king and the rook. So let's look at that. Again, try to visualize, take your time, work on your thought process, work on your thought skills. The process isn't what we're doing right now when we're looking at things. That's the content. We're actually doing the analysis. The process is knowing what you have to do. For instance, the criticality assessment is part of your process. But what we're doing now is the content. All right, so knight takes e6. We're analyzing. Bishop takes e3. Knight takes c7 check. Now clearly the black king is going to attack that knight on c7, so he can't just get away with it. If the black king went to a crazy square like f8, then white could, if worse comes to worse, just play f takes e3 and take the bishop, and he would have gotten away with winning the pawn. So the critical line is for black to attack the knight on c7. So knight takes e6, bishop takes e3, knight c7 check. Let's say he doesn't block the bishop and the knight with the king and instead plays king to d8 and not d7. Okay, so king d8 hitting the knight, and now if white takes the bishop, f takes e3, then black will play king takes c7. So therefore white needs to go ahead and take the rook there. So again, we'll start at the start and show how we're building this up in the analysis. Knight takes e6, bishop takes e3, knight to c7 check, king to d8, knight takes a8, and now black's going to save the bishop on e3. Notice he can't go back to b6 because the knight on a8, if you could visualize that knight on a8, it's guarding the b6 square. So the bishop would go back to c5 or a7 or even d4 possibly. Now at this point, if you stopped, it wouldn't really be a quiescence error, but it would be a little bit too soon. Let's review the material here. White has captured the pawn on e6, and then he's captured the rook on a8. Black has captured the bishop on e3 and then saved the bishop. So white has won a rook and a pawn for a bishop, and you might say, well, that's the end of that. White's just winning, so knight takes e6 is good, because if he takes the bishop, I fork him with knight c7, and if he takes the knight on e6, I take his bishop on c5, End of story. But a good player wouldn't stop there because there's a problem with the position. If you look at that position, and now let's look at it. Let's show you what we've been visualizing. If you look at knight takes e6, bishop takes e3, knight takes c7 check, king to d8, knight takes a8, and now let's tuck the bishop back somewhere. Let's say, I don't know, bishop to a7. That may not be the best move, but all right, Mr. Computer, don't undo my moves. If you look at this position, the knight on a8 is trapped. And you might say, so what? I already have a rook and a pawn for a bishop. Even if he traps the knight and he gets it, I'll have a rook and a pawn for a knight and a bishop, and I'm okay. Well, that's not really true. In the Reinfeld values, the 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 values, you'd be right. A knight is 3, a bishop is 3, a rook is 5, and a pawn is 1. So that would be 6 for 6. But the Reinfeld values in this kind of imbalance is incorrect. A bishop and a knight is worth considerably more than a rook and a pawn. If you're playing in a game, and unless you're in a deep end game, you give up early in the game, you give up a bishop and a knight for a rook and a pawn, you're already pretty much going to be almost lost. That's how bad doing that is. So you don't want to randomly give up bishop and knight for rook and pawn. So the key here would be, is there any way to save that knight? And we have a couple tempos. It's white's move. Black's threatening something like maybe b5 followed by bishop to b7, hitting that knight. Well, we do have a move here that we could play. We could play something like knight to a4 or knight to d5. The idea of knight to d5 is we're going to guard our knight coming back out to b6 or c7. So for instance, if we play knight d5 and he attacks that knight with his knight or his bishop, we could bring our knight to b6 guarding that knight, and we've escaped with our knight. So for instance, we could play knight to d5. If he plays knight f6, we could play knight to b6, knight on 8 to b6, saving the knight. Now we are losing the pawn, but once we save the knight, we're going to be up a rook for a bishop, and we call that winning the exchange. If you're ahead a rook for a bishop or a knight, that's winning the exchange. Winning the exchange is not when you win a queen for a rook or a knight for a pawn or anything like that. It doesn't mean you're coming out ahead in a trade. It means you're winning a rook for a bishop or a knight. A lot of my new students, when I test them, and I say, what does it mean to win the exchange? They say, it means you come out ahead in the trade like a queen for a rook or a bishop for a pawn, and that's not really what it means. If you read a chess book like Karpov's Best Games or The Logical Chess Move by Move or whatever you're reading and it says Karpov's going to win the exchange, they're not talking about coming out ahead in a trade. They're talking about winning a rook for a bishop or a knight, which is a very specific way of coming out ahead in a trade. So here, white has saved the knight on a8, and even if black takes that pawn, white's going to be winning. All right, so what have we learned here? We learned that this is probably a critical position, that we have a discovered attack. We can't just stop after knight takes e6 and say he'll take the knight on e6, we'll take the bishop. We had to analyze further. If we analyze to the point where we take the rook, I would think most people around 1600 would analyze at least till they take the rook. But at people above 1900, I think they would calculate to make sure that knight on a8 could be saved and is not trapped. Because if you don't do that, and the knight ends up being trapped, it would go from being a great combination that would win for white to a bad combination that may even win for black. So you have to be very careful about those trapped pieces on the other side of the board at the end of the combination. If you stop too soon in a combination, we call that a quiescence error. Here, not seeing that you could bring the knight out, I wouldn't really call it quiescence error, but it is stopping the analysis a little bit too soon. All right, so we have a fairly critical position here. All right, so we've been talking about a criticality assessment. We've been talking about improving your thought process. There's so many aspects to a thought process, and today we've been mostly talking about, again, what I call micro time management. How much time do you spend on a move? Let's say, let's take the position we were just in and say this was a 45-45 game, and let's say at the time of white's move here, it's fairly early in the opening. Let's say white has 37 minutes left in this position. Let's say we're on move 11. Well, Botvinnik's rule would no longer apply because we have a possible combination that might win the whole game. We're not just developing our pieces. So we're not too worried about getting Botvinnik's rule at this point. So let's say we have 37 minutes left, which is actually too low. You should probably have more in this point. But let's say you have 37 minutes left. How much time is reasonable in this move? Well, if you think that you could actually win the whole game here, and of course if, these are two grandmasters playing and white gets away with this game is toast. So you could easily take 7 to 10 minutes on this one move just to make sure everything works. And once you do it, you don't want to play super fast. For instance, let's say you do take 7 minutes and you play knight takes pawn, and he plays bishop takes e3. Well, you know from previous analysis that it's pretty forced that you have to play knight c7 check, but you shouldn't do it instantly. If you do it and it turns out it's a mistake, I call that the ABC error. You can watch my video on the ABC error. You want to take a little bit of time here. Now, do you want to take another 7 to 10 minutes? Of course not. But you want to check your analysis and make sure that f takes e3 isn't better, that knight takes g7 isn't better, that you don't have a surprise move like knight to d5 or bishop b5 check, something else. And maybe you're going to take 45 seconds or something, but don't make your move immediately here. All right, so then you're going to play knight c7 check. He's going to hit the knight. Again, you're going to take a few seconds to say, do I have anything better? Can I win the bishop and save my knight, or can I check him or do something? And here again, you might take 20 seconds and realize, no, I got to take the rook. And when black saves the bishop, let's say this time he saves it to d4, I don't know. Now you want to start doing some thought. Now you really want to slow down again, because once you get that knight out, you're winning, so you just have to make sure you can really do it. For instance, if you play knight a4, and then he plays b5, and you bring your knight back to the knight on a4 to b6, that doesn't really work very well. What's wrong with this position here? Well, what's wrong is the two knights are awkward. They're guarding each other. Grandmaster Larry Kaufman calls those redundant knights. And even though you're threatening to take the bishop, if he saves the bishop, he could play bishop b7 or bishop e6. Eventually he's going to be threatening to maybe take the knight on a8 and then trap the other knight in the corner. So this would be not as good as the line we looked at before, where you have knight to d5. So again, you can't just make these moves real fast and say, well, I planned on playing knight a4 here followed by knight b6, because maybe it really doesn't work as well as you think. So you got to be careful about planning things ahead of time, looking ahead for 3 or 4 or 5 moves, and then making them all really fast and finding out your first couple moves were great, but then after that, you missed all kinds of stuff because you played the moves that you had looked at several moves ago. Again, I call that the ABC error. All right, we've talked a lot about thought process today. I think it's been a good video. Again, please tell your friends about the channel Dan Heisman Chess. And if you'd like the video, great. And you could subscribe to the channel. I think I have around 8,000 subscribers, maybe 9,000. So maybe someday we'll even get to 10,000. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.